After 38 years of marriage, it ended with a single, careless gesture and a tiny brass key sliding across the table. At 62, Margaret Collins sat in a quiet attorney's office, her hands folded tightly in her lap, as the life she had built piece by piece was dismantled in front of her. Across from her sat Richard Collins, the man she had trusted for nearly 4 decades. He looked composed, detached, more like a businessman closing a deal than a husband ending a lifetime of shared history. There was no apology, no hesitation, just paperwork. The house wasn't in her name. The accounts had been moved years ago. The business they had built together had quietly become his alone, long before she realized what was happening. Every sacrifice she had made, every early morning, every late night balancing books and keeping things running, none of it existed in the documents that now defined her future. "The settlement is final," the lawyer said, sliding a thin folder toward her. Margaret didn't open it. She already knew what it contained. Almost nothing. Then, as if it were an afterthought, a small object was placed on the table. A key. Worn. Unremarkable. Pointless. "What is this?" she asked quietly. Richard barely looked at her. "Just something from your old things." Old things. 38 years reduced to that. Margaret picked up the key, feeling its cold weight in her palm. It was the only thing she was leaving with, and somehow, it didn't feel like the end. For 3 days, Margaret Collins didn't touch the key. It sat on the small kitchen counter of the temporary apartment she could barely afford, catching the morning light like a question she wasn't ready to answer. Everything around her felt stripped down to survival, finding a place to sleep, figuring out what came next, learning how to exist without the structure she had built her entire adult life around. The silence was the hardest part. No footsteps in the next room, no familiar routines, no one calling her name. Just the quiet realization that after 38 years, she had somehow been erased from her own life. She moved through each day slowly, almost mechanically, trying to make sense of what had happened. How everything could be taken so completely, so cleanly, as if it had never truly belonged to her in the first place. And yet, the key remained. Small, insistent, impossible to ignore forever. On the 4th morning, with nothing left to distract her and nowhere left to hide from the truth, Margaret picked it up and turned it over in her fingers. The metal felt heavier than it should have, as if it carried something more than its size suggested. If this was all she had been given, then she would at least see it through. The storage facility was on the edge of town, rows of identical metal doors stretching endlessly beneath a pale sky. Each one held someone else's version of later, things forgotten, delayed, avoided. Margaret walked slowly, counting the numbers until she found the unit that matched the small tag on the key. She paused for only a moment, then slid the key into the lock. It fit perfectly. And when she turned it, the soft click echoed louder than expected, like the beginning of something she hadn't yet understood. The metal door lifted with a low, hollow sound, and for a moment, Margaret Collins simply stood there, unable to move. She had expected dust, clutter, forgotten boxes filled with things that no longer mattered. Instead, what she saw stopped her completely. The space inside wasn't chaotic. It was organized, deliberate. Boxes lined the walls in neat rows, each one labeled in a handwriting she recognized instantly. Her own. "That's not possible," she whispered, stepping inside slowly, as if the scene might disappear if she moved too quickly. These weren't random belongings. They were records, carefully preserved. She reached for the nearest box, her hands trembling as she lifted the lid. Inside were notebooks, financial logs she had kept years ago, back when the business was just beginning. Late nights, careful calculations, every dollar tracked, every decision documented. Back then, she believed they were building something together, a partnership, or at least that's what she had been led to believe. She flipped through the pages, her handwriting precise, methodical, bringing back memories she had long buried. This wasn't just bookkeeping. It was the foundation. She set the notebook aside and opened another box. Contracts, legal documents. Her eyes moved across the first page and then stopped. Her name, not beside his, not underneath, at the top, listed as the primary owner. Margaret's breath caught as she reached for more documents, flipping through them faster now. Because with each page, one truth became clearer. The life she thought had been taken from her had never fully belonged to him in the first place. Margaret's hands moved faster now, opening box after box, her breathing shallow as the pieces began to fall into place. What she had dismissed as old things were not random records. They were evidence. Contracts dated from the earliest days of the business. Financial statements she had personally tracked. Agreements signed at a time when everything had been uncertain and when decisions had been made based on practicality, not power. And in nearly every document, her name came first, not beside Richard's, not beneath it, above it. She paused, her fingers tightening around one of the pages as a memory surfaced, something she hadn't thought about in years. Back then, when they were just starting out, her credit had been stronger. It had made sense to register things under her name. Temporary, he had said, just until things grew more stable. She had trusted him. Of course she had. Why wouldn't she? But now, standing in that quiet storage unit, Margaret began to notice things she hadn't seen before, or perhaps hadn't allowed herself to see. Some documents were incomplete. Others had signatures that didn't match the dates, transfers that looked official on the surface, but lacked the final validation that made them legally binding. Her pulse quickened. Because this wasn't just oversight, it was manipulation. Careful, calculated, hidden beneath years of trust. "What did you do, Richard?" she murmured under her breath. And for the first time since the divorce, Margaret didn't feel lost. She felt something else, something sharper, more dangerous. She was beginning to understand the truth, and once she did, there would be no going back. At the back of the unit, partially hidden behind stacked boxes, something caught Margaret Collins's attention. A wooden chest. Old. Solid. Different from everything else. It didn't look like storage. It looked intentional. She moved toward it slowly, her instincts sharpening with each step. A thin layer of dust covered the surface, undisturbed for years, maybe longer. When she brushed it away, a small keyhole appeared, simple, precise, familiar. Margaret's breath slowed as her hand moved instinctively to her coat pocket. The tiny brass key, the one he had dismissed, the one he thought meant nothing. For a moment, she didn't move. The key hovered just inches from the lock, her heart pounding louder than the silence around her. This wasn't just about old documents anymore. This was something deeper, something he hadn't expected her to find. She inserted the key, turned it. The lock opened with a soft, decisive click. Margaret exhaled slowly, not realizing she had been holding her breath, and lifted the lid. Inside were letters, dozens of them, carefully arranged, tied together with faded ribbon, and beneath them, more documents, thicker, heavier, unmistakably legal. Her hands trembled slightly as she picked up the first letter and unfolded it. The handwriting wasn't hers, and it wasn't Richard's. It belonged to someone else. Someone who had tried to reach her. Someone who had known. As her eyes moved across the page, the silence of the storage unit seemed to close in around her. And for the first time since everything had been taken from her, Margaret didn't feel empty. She felt something far more powerful. She was about to understand the truth. Margaret didn't rush. That was the first thing that changed. Sitting there on the cold concrete floor of the storage unit, Margaret Collins read each letter slowly, carefully, allowing every word to settle before moving on. The woman she had been before, trusting, forgiving, quick to avoid conflict, might have reacted differently. But not now. Not after everything. The letters were clear, precise, written by a lawyer who had tried repeatedly to reach her years ago. Warnings she had never received, concerns she had never been allowed to hear. There were inconsistencies in the ownership transfers, missing authorizations, signatures that didn't align with official records. At the time, it had all been buried beneath trust. Now, it stood exposed. Margaret's hands no longer trembled. Her breathing slowed, her thoughts sharpening into something steadier than emotion. Clarity. She set the letters aside and looked around the unit again, not as someone searching for answers, but as someone who had just found them. The truth wasn't complicated. It had simply been hidden. For years, Richard had built everything on a foundation that wasn't entirely his, and more importantly, one that had never been fully taken from her. By the time Margaret stood and stepped out into the fading light, something inside her had shifted completely. She wasn't walking away from the past anymore. She was walking toward it. The next morning, she made a call. Not to her ex-husband, not to her children, but to a law firm whose name appeared again and again in the documents she had just uncovered. And this time, she wasn't asking questions. She was ready to act. The receptionist almost dismissed her at first. Just another older woman with questions about old paperwork. But there was something in Margaret Collins's voice, calm, steady, unmistakably certain, that made her pause. Within an hour, Margaret found herself sitting across from a lawyer who had spent years unraveling cases just like this. He listened without interrupting as she laid everything out. The documents, the inconsistencies, the letters she had found hidden away for decades. Her hands didn't shake. Her voice didn't waver. When she finished, the room fell quiet. The lawyer leaned back slowly, studying her with a look that was no longer polite curiosity, but focus. "Mrs. Collins," he said carefully, "do you understand what you may have here?" Margaret met his gaze without hesitation. "I think I'm starting to." He nodded once, glancing down at the documents again. "If these records are valid, and they appear to be, you were never fully removed from ownership of that business. The transfer your husband relied on may not hold up legally." The words settled in the room like something heavy, but not unexpected. Margaret didn't react with shock. That part was over. "What does that mean?" she asked. The lawyer chose his words carefully. "It means he may have built everything on something that doesn't legally belong only to him." For a moment, the world felt still, not because it was ending, but because it was shifting. And for the first time in decades, Margaret wasn't on the losing side of it anymore. Margaret didn't hesitate. The moment she understood what she was holding, Margaret Collins stopped thinking about what she had lost and focused on what could be proven. The documents spoke clearly. They didn't need emotion. They didn't need explanation. They simply existed, and that was enough. Within days, the lawyer began building the case, organizing every piece of evidence Margaret had uncovered. Old contracts, financial records, the letters that had warned of irregularities, all of it came together with a precision that made it impossible to ignore. When the legal notice reached Richard, he dismissed it at first. A mistake, a misunderstanding, something that could be handled quickly. But then he read the attached documents, and everything changed. Because this time, Margaret hadn't come to him with accusations. She had come with proof, the kind that didn't argue, didn't beg, didn't rely on anyone believing her. It simply existed and demanded to be acknowledged. Meetings were called. Lawyers were consulted. Strategies were discussed behind closed doors. But every path led to the same conclusion. The risk of fighting was greater than the cost of settling. For the first time in decades, Richard found himself in a position he had never expected, on the defensive. And Margaret, the woman who had once trusted without question, who had walked away from a lifetime with nothing but a key, now held something far more powerful. Control, not over him, but over the truth. And this time, she wasn't letting it go. 6 weeks later, Margaret Collins found herself sitting in another lawyer's office. But this time, everything was different. The air didn't feel heavy. The silence didn't feel suffocating. And Margaret herself, she was no longer the woman who had sat quietly while her life was taken from her. Now she understood. The documents placed in front of her told a new story. A revised settlement, financial compensation that reflected decades of unpaid work, legal recognition of her original ownership stake, something that had been ignored, buried, and nearly erased. But not anymore. Across the table sat Richard, the same man who had once looked so composed, so certain of his control. Now he seemed smaller, tired. The confidence he had carried for years replaced by something else. Awareness. He didn't meet her eyes, not because he didn't care, but because now he understood. "You could have taken more," he said quietly, almost as if the idea unsettled him. Margaret didn't respond right away. She simply signed the final page, her movements calm, deliberate. Then she looked up. "This was never about taking everything," she said softly. "It was about not leaving with nothing." The words settled between them, simple but final, because this time Margaret wasn't walking away erased. She wasn't defined by what had been taken from her. She stood up slowly, the papers now hers, the outcome no longer uncertain. And as she turned toward the door, one truth followed her with quiet certainty. She had not just recovered what was hers, she had reclaimed herself. In the months that followed, Margaret Collins didn't try to rebuild the life she had lost. She built a different one, smaller, quieter, but entirely her own. The new house she chose wasn't grand, but every detail of it carried meaning. Her name was on every document, every decision, every signature, every responsibility, hers. Not shared out of assumption, not handed over out of trust. Understood. For the first time in decades, she knew exactly what belonged to her. But what changed most wasn't where she lived. It was how she lived. Margaret didn't return to the business she had once helped build. Not because she couldn't, but because she no longer needed to prove anything within it. That chapter had already said what it needed to say. Instead, she started something new. a modest financial advisory service focused on women who had spent years trusting others to handle their lives, only to find themselves lost when that trust was broken. Women who didn't understand the documents they signed. Women who believed loyalty would protect them. Women like her. She taught them what she had learned the hard way: how to read contracts, how to ask questions, how to understand ownership before someone else quietly took it away. And slowly, something unexpected happened. She didn't just recover, she grew stronger than she had ever been. Not because of what she gained, but because of what she finally understood. And every morning, on a small table near her window, sat the one thing that started it all: the tiny brass key. No longer meaningless, no longer small, but a reminder that sometimes the thing you're given when you have nothing is the one thing that changes everything. Months later, Margaret Collins stood in the quiet of her new home, sunlight resting softly across the table where a single object remained in clear view: the tiny brass key. The same one that had once felt meaningless, almost insulting. Now it meant everything. She picked it up gently, turning it between her fingers, remembering the moment it was handed to her. Cold, dismissive, final. Back then, it had felt like the end of her life as she knew it. The moment everything was taken. But standing here now, she understood the truth. It hadn't been the end. It had been the beginning. Margaret placed the key back down, her expression calm, no longer shaped by betrayal or loss. Because what she had gained went far beyond money, property, or legal recognition. She had gained clarity, strength, and the quiet confidence of a woman who finally understood her own worth. Sometimes, life will leave you with almost nothing. And in that moment, it feels like everything is over. But what if that nothing is actually the one thing you need to rebuild everything? We often measure value by what we can see: money, houses, status. But the most powerful things in life are often hidden in the smallest details. A choice, a realization, a single moment where you stop accepting less than you deserve. If this story touched your heart, share your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever had something small that ended up changing your life? And don't forget to subscribe, because sometimes the next story you hear might be the one that helps you see your own life in a completely new way.